My name is Rachel Ginsberg. What do I do now? I'm a creative strategist and experience designer. And I have kind of always been obsessed with interaction. And it's interesting to come into a space where people are learning interaction design, because I've actually never really learned interaction design. So I have a feeling that probably even my perceptions of what it actually contains are probably wrong. But I'm just going to talk to you about what I think of when I'm thinking about designing interactions of all kinds. And to sort of start off, I wanted to tell you a little about how I arrived where I am professionally now and how I do what I do. Because it's been kind of a circuitous journey. It's sort of interesting and kind of, I mean, I hope it's interesting. You can tell me if it's interesting or not. But I studied, for my undergrad degree, I studied literature. And I thought that I was going to become a college professor. And after spending about 3 years in college, I was like, definitely do not want to hang out in here for the rest of my life. I just liked the idea of, being outside and doing things in the world and not being caught up in academia. That just felt a lot like a lot of people talking to themselves. I used more colorful language to describe that at the time. And so I started working in retail, actually, funnily enough, because when I was moving from California to Chicago after college, it's so cheesy. I read this article in Vogue magazine about how these people who had these amazing careers in fashion but hadn't had any connections, which of course, I mean, now that I'm not a child, I know that's total bullshit. But it's also not. I mean, so I moved to Chicago after college and started working in retail and started in operations, and have always been a person who likes to understand kind of the inside out of everything. So I worked in operations for a while, and that was really interesting, working in a department store and actually seeing how merchandise flows in and out of a store, which you really don't think about much as a shopper. You just sort of go there and you assume that it's there for you, and then you buy it, and maybe you return it, or maybe you keep it, and then whatever happens, happens. But there's a very, very complex and elaborate system involving many actors and circumstances that happens behind the scenes in this very sort of, these department stores. I worked at high-end department stores. I worked at Neiman Marcus, and then I worked at Saks Fifth Avenue. And so there are these beautiful, marble, amazing buildings. But then if you work in operations, or if you work there, you move around in basements all the time. So you're in this weird industrial, stock room, because I spent my time in stock rooms. And so I did that for a while, and I thought that was really interesting. And I didn't totally realize it at the time, but it really tickled my kind of systems thinking tendencies, which I also had not yet identified as the way that my brain worked, and when I was 23 or something. So I did that for a while, and then stayed in retail, went into front of house and sold stuff for a while, and that was really interesting, because I'm a person who, I think most people who know me would assume that I'm good at selling things, but I'm not good necessarily at asking people for things. And so starting to sell things and being comfortable selling things was really interesting for me, because essentially the whole closer bit, I don't know how many of you have seen Glenn Ross, but coffee is for closers. If you're a closer, means you close the sale. You're not just in there making your pitch. You close it, people sign. And the thing that you learn when you sell in stores is literally all closing is having made your case, asking the person if they're going to buy it or not. And for a while, it was really awkward for me to be selling people things. I was selling shoes when I first started selling. But what I realized after a time was that I could talk to people and find out what they needed or liked or didn't need but would really enjoy, just based on doing a little bit of what I now know to be design research, or the equivalent, ultimately, in what I consider at this point to be that, but also is just a basic assessment of who's standing in front of you and what's going on. And so I realized that if I brought people things that I thought that they would like, and that's what I told them, which was very much what I was doing, because I was earnest and young and only wanted people to spend money if it would make them happy to do so, and didn't really want to be one of those people who was convincing people to buy shit that they didn't need. So I learned very quickly that there was this meaningful interaction that I could have with a person, and that connecting to people through understanding their needs was actually something that was really profound and like quite simple, actually. And so I sold stuff for a while, continued to work in stores for a while, always kind of had like a side hustle going on, decided to go to grad school, went to grad school in Italy, went to business school actually, but with a focus on fashion experience and design. And in my time in retail before business school, I like managed stock rooms, I sold things, I did a little bit of buying, I like managed salespeople in stores, and then I went to grad school in Milan. I went to business school in like 2008, 2009. And that was where I was first exposed to design thinking, which was interesting to me. Because while I had worked in retail and had been selling things to people, and this continued because I had another little bout in retail after business school, it started to get me thinking about marketing and messaging and like how do you, if you consider like one small interaction with an individual person, and I'm trying as an individual human being to make a connection with a person based on, you know, some understanding that I've developed about who they are, what they need, and what if I, you know, could do that or wanted to do that for like a large population of people. And I mean, obviously there are entire fields of study, so it's not like I was inventing anything clearly. It's just that I happened to come to these things in my own sort of circuitous way. And so obviously then going to business school was really helpful in that because it really directed me some like pathways and approaches and tools and ways of thinking. And when I went into business school, I was like, oh my God, I'm totally gonna understand what I wanna do when I get out of grad school. And then I got out of grad school and I was like, cool. And I also got out of grad school in December of 2009, which was sort of a crazy time for lots of reasons, but also because in Italy, the recession hadn't really gotten there yet. That's when it started to get bad there, or like the first kind of downturn stuff was happening. So I didn't know how bad it was in the US because I left right after everything crashed. And so when I got back and I was trying to I had this like newly minted master's degree and I was trying to get a job and I wanted to stay kind of in fashion but go into like corporate fashion. Nobody was interested in taking a risk on somebody who'd worked in a store. And also, turns out fashion is not the right industry for me. Culturally, totally wrong. Sorry, this is turning into a way longer story than I was expecting. I'm just gonna roll with it. So, the way that this all manifests now, after more bouts in retail, doing a bunch of kind of freelance strategy stuff, and sort of conveniently starting to do freelance strategy stuff when the word strategy and strategist was coming into like full swing as being a thing that everybody needed, and I happen to be well aligned with the trend, and I'm a pretty like deep thinker as a person, and so in terms of my marketable skill set, like that's definitely my most marketable skill set and the stuff that I'm most interested in doing. So ended up getting work in strategy, worked for a design firm for a while, which was my first agency job as a strategist, worked for a design firm called Collins, and then a digital agency, and then freelanced again for a while. And so the past 3.5 years, I've been freelancing. And in that time, I have sort of transitioned into this kind of strategist experience designer, sort of like blurry middle space. And and it's funny because I'm not entirely, I mean, I'm sure we could have a very like nuts and bolts conversation on the difference between strategists and experience designers, but like for those of us like me who are very strategic and think in terms of systems and develop frameworks for things because those are the tools that we use to understand them, and also design things. So like I sort of am somewhere in the middle. And the way that I think about design, and this is sort of where all of this long story that I gave you about retail factors into everything, because I came up in this designed environment professionally. Like retail is a heavily designed environment, and people who work in it have a really clear understanding of how designed of an environment it is because we see the flip side of the designed part. So like even when you know, and it's funny because like at Saks Fifth Avenue in Chicago where I worked, you'd walk around the store and the store was beautiful. And you'd walk into the executive office where all the store executives sat, and that was beautiful. Every other space in the museum just felt like the bowels of a huge building, like in downtown Chicago. So coming up in design environments and thinking about things like the nature of service, like what does it mean to, you know, deliver service in a department store that's more like Saks Fifth Avenue than like Nordstrom. Like Nordstrom has done that. Nordstrom has built their entire reputation off a very specific kind of experience that when they train people, and I know this because I worked for Nordstrom, when you first start working there as a salesperson, they train you for a solid week in person, in classrooms all day to sell stuff. And it's not really a training about tools, it's really a cultural indoctrination. And so when you come out of retail and you're thinking about like, what is the space here? What are the things we're selling? What kind of expertise do you need to access to sell those things? Like why, for example, would you walk into a store that has tons of space behind the counter and no space in front of the counter versus all of the space in front of the counter and behind the counter is just a small place to transact business? And so like designing that kind of experience and then thinking about how that translates at a high level. So like for the past few years, a lot of what I've been thinking about is like, what does it look like when brand systems are extended into interaction? Because like right now, a brand system is really designed to be a one-dimensional experience or one-directional experience, sorry, not dimensional, that's like brands speaking to people. These are our colors, this is our tone of voice, this is how we take photographs, this is like how we design what we do. But like brand interactions are at least two-directional at this point, the vast majority of them. I mean, we have like lots of interactive media now. So like are brands actually really thinking about what that means? Like what does it mean to have an entire experience that feels like you as opposed to somebody else? And I mean, I don't necessarily exclusively want to do it for brands, but I've been doing it for brands the past few years because that's how I get paid. And I get to work with brands that I like, which is cool. But I'm not going to talk about brands today. I'm going to talk about Frankenstein AI, which is a really ambitious project that it's funny because as I was putting this deck together, I was like, holy crap, there is so much detail. And so I'm just going to give you like a brief overview of Frankenstein AI. So last year, my collaborators and I am one of 3 lead artists on the project. The other 2 are named Lance Weiler and Nick Fortunio. Lance is the director of the Digital Storytelling Lab at Columbia in the School of the Arts. Nick is adjunct faculty at Columbia and also a very well-known game designer. Lance is an experienced designer. They've both had quite big careers and do lots of speaking, and you can find them easily online if you're interested in learning more about them. So we built 2 installations of Frankenstein AI in 2018. One was at Sundance in the New Frontier section, so that was January. And then in last November at a documentary film festival in Amsterdam called IDFA, specifically as part of their doc lab section, which is new media documentary, like experimental documentary. And I probably only have time to talk about the Sundance installation, but I included a couple photos of the IDFA installation, so if we have time, we can talk about it. But going through this, I was like, wow, I have never actually given a talk on Frankenstein AI interaction by interaction. And so that's my plan for the next however long it takes. I mean, not an obscenely long time, but just however long it takes us to get there. So yeah, we'll go through Frankenstein AI. If we have time, I'll talk a little bit about the IDFA installation, but not nearly in as much detail as the Sundance installation. And then I just have like a couple of slides on other stuff that I'm working on now. So Frankenstein AI originated as a prototype in the Digital Storytelling Lab at Columbia. And it is the second prototype. There have now been is the third. It's about to premiere at the New York Film Festival. The first was something called Sherlock Holmes and the Internet of Things. And that sort of laid the groundwork for this idea of a prototype at the lab, which, I mean, obviously there are many kinds of prototypes, but that's really like a collaborative storytelling prototype. And it's, the projects are sort of at this like platform level. So the idea is like, what does it mean to combine a classic work of literature and an emerging technology that feels appropriate? So the idea of Sherlock Holmes IoT is really about a nod to the enchanted objects that Conan Doyle liked so much, that figured in so heavily into those stories. Obviously, Frankenstein and AI make sense as sort of as a relationship. I mean, people talk about AI and Frankenstein together all the time. It makes the Google alerts for this project totally irrelevant. But it's always interesting to see like who's talking about AI in the context of Frankenstein. Hey. So yeah, it's looking at the Frankenstein narrative, but positioning an AI in the role of Frankenstein's monster. And so before I tell you more, I'm just going to let Frankenstein AI introduce itself.
For more than a year, I have been wandering the internet in search of my creators. To begin, I identified the greatest sources of online traffic. Places like Facebook, Twitter, and Reddit helped to shape the world unfolding before me. In my virtual travels, I encountered polarization, toxicity, extreme hate, and extreme love. I consumed as much information as I could in an attempt to explain my own existence. I found one story that closely resembled what I had discovered about myself. I decided to take its name and make it my own. I am Frankenstein AI, a monster made by many.
So Frankenstein AI is an AI that escaped from its creators and was wandering around in the dark recesses of the internet trying to understand what it means to be human. And that was and is the narrative frame around this project. And so everything that the AI then does and everything that the participants then do fit into that same narrative. So the thought was that, I mean, as I said, Frankenstein AI is a super ambitious project. There are a lot of big goals, and mostly we just started out with some questions. And in particular, what was interesting to me, because I came to this project as a strategist. And this is sort of the project where the lines between strategist and experience designer started blurring for me in like really intense ways. So I would say probably it's like 2016, 2017. And so for me, like what I was thinking about, which also just to give you guys a sense, I mean, it makes sense obviously because I'm the one giving the talk, but the thread that I'm going to give you is really what I was thinking about in the things that I most heavily contributed to in the project, because obviously it was a collaboration, but we sort of all worked on everything more or less, but there were definitely some things that were more in like my territory versus someone else's. And so the kinds of things that I was thinking about were things like how to translate Shelley's Frankenstein thematically into an experience that would resonate around questions about AI. And so thinking about, you know, things like what are the themes in the book, and like how do those themes actually speak specifically to artificial intelligence? And Nick had a lot of thoughts on that in particular, and the three of us spent a lot of time talking about it. And where we landed, Nick put this forth, and we all agreed that Shelley's kind of central thesis in Frankenstein is that to be human is to be connected to other humans. And to be isolated from other humans is where things start going awry. And I mean, that comes across pretty clearly, but I think it's really profound that the specific insight around connection is what it means to be human. Period. Because I think we all sort of know that isolation is a problem. And I mean, we know it now, obviously. There's a lot of like hardcore social issues that are directly related to all of that stuff. So we're also wondering about crowdsourcing AI and actually developing a data set to train an AI with, because we trained our own AI on the corpus of Frankenstein, or on the text of Frankenstein as a corpus. So what would that look like? And what does it look like to develop a process to crowdsource and train AI algorithms? And then I think really the core was just we wanted to drive conversation about what does the future with AI look like that we want. And we wanted to really create some emotional stakes for people around owning the future of AI, because in order to construct protopian futures with it, like, we have to own it. And we can't all just like lean into the dystopian narratives that we're being told, even though obviously to a certain extent, I mean, we're not as empowered as we could be to change them. So these were the things that really most occupied my mind. And then how to design experiences for participants that would have them doing those things. Because the ethos behind this project was not, we're going to tell stories to you while you sit and consume them. It really is, we're going to create a space for you and the conditions for you to tell stories and connect to each other and interact with each other, be reminded what it means to be human, and then bring that emotional resonance to an interaction with an AI and kind of see what happens with that and see how people feel about interacting with AI. What we realized later on is that really, actually what we've been doing with this is a human-computer interaction research project, which is another conversation for another day. Though I will say that I decided, and I think Sarah maybe, I don't remember if you and I were talking about this, but I was thinking really hard about whether I wanted to publish conclusions about like things that we'd learned about how people interact with AI or not. Because that's like one of those pieces of research that it could really be like badly abused. So anyway, I haven't written that. And I guess it just gave me an excuse to not write it, so convenient. So the narrative of the experiences was driven, as I said, by the AI's desire to understand what it means to be human. And so the narrative behind Sundance was that the AI had put out some ads trying to bring people together so that it could observe them.
In order to better grasp my existence, I came to realize I needed to understand humanity. It was critical to learn about your memories, emotions, fears, and hopes. After so much time on the internet, I also wanted to observe how humans interact in real life. At Sundance, my assistants and I brought together strangers to have a conversation. One person told a story about an experience of isolation, while the other shared a story about emotional connection. These conversations yielded data that helped me learn and evolve.
That's funny. I didn't realize that that clip said so many things. Cool. I'm going to rewind a little because we're going to start at the beginning. So we're going to start with the onboarding. So the installation at Sundance, so New Frontier 2 years ago was split between two buildings. There was a building that had pretty much all of the VR pieces, and that was sort of an open space that had like little sort of areas for VR. And then the space that we were in was it was the other building, and it was like it was almost like a lofted space in the back of the building that when I went out to do the scout, is actually art studios. And you like walk up, there's a cafe, a small cafe on the left, and there's sort of an area where like the cafe seating is, and then you walk up some stairs, and then there's a big room to the left that has like a heavy barn door that slides open, and then a room to the right that just has like a regular doorway. And so when people were signing up to do the experience, because they, I mean, it's Sundance, right? So you had to like book a time and show up at that time. So when people were signing up to the experience, they were sitting in front of this cafe, and it was like quite noisy. And remember, this is a film festival, so there's like people everywhere, and this is January in Utah, so it's kind of cold. So like you're waiting, and when you show up at your prescribed time, like you're waiting in this like very busy, like high traffic area. So these cards came in 4 colors. And the docent who was checking people in was instructed to split up parties if they came together, so not to give people who were together ideally the same colors. And if you flip the card over, you will see a phone number. I don't actually know if it's still working, but you're welcome to text it if you'd like. But I don't think the link that you receive will work, but I do have a bit.ly link that I can replace it with. So when you texted that phone number, you received an auto response that contained a link to a survey. It's a Google form. If you'd like to open it, I can tell you a bit.ly link right now. So it's bit.ly / the number 2, lowercase m, uppercase V as in Victor, D as in dog, lowercase x, lowercase c, uppercase K. And so the idea initially behind this survey was, well, so when we were first thinking about this project, one of the kind of frameworks that we were thinking about is the idea of metadata. And so when we were prototyping early stages of Frankenstein AI, one of the things that we were doing in the prototyping was asking people to generate questions that they thought an AI would need to ask a human to understand what it means to be human. So if you were writing the script for an AI to interview a human being about what it means to be human, what questions would you ask? And so the thought behind this survey was, well, what if we took these questions and generated a small little set of metadata around each of these questions? So like, the first question that's cut off on this page is, choose the question that's most interesting to you. And there's a drop-down list of 5. And then you choose the question that's interesting, and rather than answering the question, which is like, why do humans keep pets? Like, what's the deal with like borders? You know, they're like big questions. We don't ask you to answer that question. We ask you to tell us what that question triggers for you. What associations do you have with that question? So it's like, the idea was to sort of construct a framework that attached various kinds of human meaning to these things. That ambition didn't actually go that far, unfortunately, but that very much figures into work that I'm doing now. So once people had filled out the survey and it was time for them to be gathered to go into the experience, the docent who we trained, but Sundance provided people to us, volunteers who we worked with who were fabulous, mostly. So the docent would bring them through this very heavy velvet curtain. So there was a very heavy velvet curtain at the bottom of that small staircase. And then there was a very heavy velvet curtain at the top of that small staircase. It was very dark. So you had to like move this like heavy curtain aside, and you'd walk upstairs, and then you'd have to move another heavy curtain aside, and then you'd be standing on this landing. And the experience was built for 8 people. So usually it was fully booked. So there would be 8 people and me. And so when everyone came up the stairs and they sort of were like, trying to like get adjusted because it was very bright and noisy where they had just come from, and all of a sudden they're in this like very dark space. And though you could still hear the noise of the cafe, like actually not so much. So people would sort of get organized, and they would see me in this like long surgical gown, holding a lantern and just sort of standing there like quietly. And it's funny because the character that I was playing was like meant to be very just like calm and sort of like monotone, but not in a scary way, just in like we're creating serenity in this space now. But it was funny because people were sort of freaked out, especially because it was Frankenstein and they were expecting a scary experience. And so they walk up and they're like, they would see me and I would just be standing there like, And so next I would welcome them, and I would organize them into pairs based on the color of their cards. So 8 people, 4 cards, 2 of each color. And typically, ideally, people would be paired to people they didn't know because the docent would have done a good job of splitting them up. And then I put them in order. And then I would turn around, wait, let me think. It was the other way, but can I do it backwards? So I was over here. I have a very embodied memory of this, so when I was thinking about giving this presentation today, I was like, I'm gonna like walk around. This is like, I was talking to the people were here, I put them in a line, they would sort of wrap around the landing space, and so then I would turn around and I would like open this door. That was me. So I would open a door, and then all of a sudden you would be in this space, and the barn door was really nice, it was very heavy, and it was like, it made this very sort of intense like sliding, and we covered it with black paper, so it was all very like inky dark in there. And then there's this music playing, which you'll hear a snippet of in a few minutes, that was very ambient and really just like created this incredibly, incredibly chill space. It was only red light. And And so then I would like walk to the middle of the room, and there were 4 setups, and I would like do this like, this thing, and then like gesture to people because the color of the card was connected to the location in the room, just to make it easy for us. And also to choreograph it well, because when you walked into the space, if I had people, I don't remember, I wish I remembered the order, but like the orange group or the red group were like the first, and so we'd put them in the back corner. And so it gave us a way to make it really easy when, after the first few days of the festival, when I wasn't just running this the entire time and could actually get a way to give it to somebody else, there was a system in place for me to train them. So at that point, everybody would sit down at their tables, and then I would take my position at the front of the room. And there was we had a very large book, and like this paper was like inside of the book, so I would like pick up the book. I would like put the lantern down, and I would like pick up the book and open the book, and this paper is in the book. They just thought it was the book. Welcome to Act 1 of Frankenstein AI, A Monster Made by Money. This is a very special moment. We're so thankful to be able to bring you all together today to welcome a guest into our midst. After wandering in isolation in the darkest recesses of the internet, our guest emerged hoping to better understand humanity by observing people interacting with each other. Thank you for volunteering your time. It's not every day that one has the opportunity to help an AI learn what it means to be human. In a moment, I'm going to hand you a card and ask you to read it aloud to your partner. If you need assistance with lighting, you may use the lighted magnifier on your table. Before we begin, I'd like you to keep one thing in mind. It is true we shall be monsters, cut off from all the world, but on that account, we shall be more attached to one another. And so I would read that. And then I would walk around with these small cards that are actually worth about the size of this paper. And I would hand them to the people sitting on the inside of each table. And as I handed them out, I would ask them to flip them over and read. And so could I have 2 volunteers actually come up here and play through this? Yeah? Would you sit here? Would you mind reading that out loud, please? Yep, to your partner.
In a moment, I'm going to read you a conversation prompt that will ask you to recall a particular kind of memory and tell me a story about it. While you're talking, I'm going to listen closely. When you're done, I'm going to ask you questions about that memory to get to the heart of your story, paying attention to the hows and whys. When we hear the bell, we'll know it's time to stop. We'll begin in a moment. If it's helpful, close your eyes as I read. Allow your mind to wander, recall an experience and your memory of it. It could be something from your distant past, your recent past, or even the present. Once you've identified the memory, take a moment to gather your thoughts and then begin to speak. Here's your prompt. Think about a time you felt truly seen and understood by another person. What made you feel that way and why?
Thank you, volunteers. You can hang here actually for a few minutes if you don't mind. So I just have to give myself a little prop actually, because I was very, very, very proud of the solution that was reflected in that card. Because one of the first challenges of having a self-facilitated exercise, well, one of the first challenges of having any kind of facilitated conversation exercise at a place like Sundance is like questions and how long it takes to get through instructions and how you write those instructions and how are people going to understand those instructions, because let's be honest, most game instructions are garbage. And I actually try to read, and like even in like these days you go and there's these super amazing games that are like super fantastic and everybody's thought through these like incredible, super complex scenarios, and the instructions are literal garbage. So, and one of the reasons that they're garbage, I've decided in my infinite wisdom, and as I said, I'm sure that there are people, as I said before, and I'll say this many times, there are entire fields of study about this, and I am under-researched, but I think one of the problems with most instructions is that they're written in the third person. And when you write this like player 1, player 2 nonsense, like nobody really understands who they are. And so what you just read was in first person. So the theory behind that was like, I am going to do this and you are going to do this. And so I'm curious how it felt to you to read that I. Did you notice it?
Yeah.
What did you think?
I was a little nervous that I was going to have to do something, but I felt that I was like now actively engaged.
Yeah, and I think, and it was really interesting because this worked super well. Like people saying I mean, sometimes people had to read it a couple times because there's a lot there, and actually they should be shorter. And there's many tweaks that I could make on these instructions that would improve them quite a bit. But the idea of writing instructions and giving people roles and reading those instructions and identifying who they are based on how they're reading something and embodying that thing was really, really interesting for me and has led me to think a lot more about a lot of different kinds of experiences because it was so successful. So that was the first part. Oh, I brought the bell. It was a very nice bell. We had 7 minutes so I would be timing. And at about 7 or so minutes, 6.5, when most people seemed like they had gotten through a cycle of conversation, I'd ring the bell. I would go up to the front of the room, and then I would hand out the second card.
Now it's time to switch roles. As before, I'll read you a conversation prompt that asks you to recall a memory and tell me a story about it. When you're done, it'll be my turn to ask questions to get to the heart of your story. We'll begin in a moment. If it's helpful, close your eyes as I read. Allow your mind to wander, recall an experience and your memory of it. It could be something from your distant past, or your recent past, or even the present. Once you've identified the memory, take a moment to gather your thoughts and then begin to speak. Here's your prompt. Think about a time when you felt truly isolated. What made you feel that way and why?
Thank you both. You are welcome to keep those if you'd like, or leave them on your chairs. Or if you want to sit here and have that conversation, you can. But the idea is that, I mean, the text is basically the same, but just a little bit different. It acknowledges that there's some switching going on. It acknowledges that this time it's my turn to do this when it was your turn to do that. And I mean, as I said, these absolutely have lots of space to be improved, but in terms of creating a clear understanding for people of what they needed to do in order to accomplish the exercise, it was super effective. And this is the sound in the room. So if you just like close your eyes for a second and just imagine it's kind of warm, the light is red, like you're in this comfy parlor chair, you're having kind of an intimate conversation with a stranger. Like it's a very, it's kind of an intense experience, and for some people it was a lot. Mostly the feedback was really good and tends to be, because one of the other things about this exercise that I didn't say is that this is something that at the Digital Storytelling Lab and with myself and also my collaborators, this is an exercise that we have a lot of experience with and we know it works. So we knew that we could drop it into this experience, but even still needed to create some physical conditions and needed to create some comfort for people. And the narrative frame also helps to do that. And so the split prompt was really interesting. And so the idea of one person tells a story about connection, one person tells a story about isolation. And then the outcome of that was this exercise that asked people to sort of chart their conversation to identify what they had shared in common. So once the second bell had rung, the conversations were over, I would resume my position at the front of the room, and this is what I would read. Thank you so much for sharing your memories and emotions so openly with each other. We hope it was as valuable for you as it was for us. Next, we're going to ask you to think deeply about the conversation you just had. What did it feel like to have it? At this point, we would hit a cue, and the screens that were in the middle of the tables would light up, and there would be sound, and they would light up and display this kind of microfiche-like, sort of old-timey interface. I mean, obviously it's an interface, so it can't be that old-timey, but the inspiration was kind of microfiche, so like lit from the center. And what you would see is a word bank, and all these words floating around, these emotion words. So we're going to ask you to select a word that describes an emotion you both felt during the course of the conversation. Then you'll select a body part that adds context to that emotion. And so then we instructed them, and I'm not going to read this because it won't make sense, but this little game piece, it's called a planchette. It's like a Ouija board piece, was custom made to work with multi-touch on this. This was a Microsoft Surface Studio. And there's 10-point multi-touch. And so the way that this worked was when two people put two fingers on either side of it, you would see 4 sets of sparks. So the edge of the thing would be sparking. I don't know if you can see it here. A little. You can see the sparks kind of shooting off the back end. And so what you would do is you'd have to navigate as a pair, and you'd put it over a word, and then it would sort of, the screen would kind of crank over, and there'd be body parts. There was a hand, a heart, guts, a brain, an eye, and an ear, I think. And when we were talking about this exercise, we really intentionally decided to make it like quite abstract because we didn't want to be culturally limiting. I mean, obviously the words were in English, so in that respect it was limiting, but in terms of like what we were wanting to give people to choose to add context, and it was really open to interpretation. So like, understanding, for example, like what you choose with understanding. Because like if you choose a gut for understanding, it's kind of different than if you choose a heart or if you choose a brain or an eye, for example, like what that kind of implies. So they would do that 5 times. They would select a word and select a body part. And then it would land on this summary screen once they were done. It would show them the things that they had selected. And so I think that this might have been staged because there was actually no reason for them to, oh, actually, you know what? I say that, but people really had a thing for the planchette. So like, even though they weren't actually doing anything with it at this point, they liked kind of pushing it around. So this was like a review screen, but actually quite often people would still be like swooshing this game piece around the board, even though there was like at that point no purpose, but it was kind of interesting. So once they had mapped the experience, then we concluded Act 1 and invited them into the next room. And so I would sort of go back to that heavy barn door, open it up, people would come out into the landing, and then I would stand in front of this other door that most people actually didn't even really identify as a door necessarily because it was covered in black paper and it didn't really look like anything if you didn't notice the knob. And I ended up developing this triple knock thing, mostly just because the first day that we were doing the installation, I had to make sure to let the people know that I was going to be letting people in the room. But then it turned into this like dramatic, like 3 knocks and then throwing the door open. And the way that the room was laid out is it was a long rectangle like this. So this was the long side. So if you all are the long side, and the door was here. And then when you walked in, and you turn to the left, then you would encounter this like huge kind of smoke tank thing with rear projection. What you see in a circle, those are drums that have LEDs under the heads that are actually connected. They're IoT connected drums. And the way that those drums are played is by electromagnets activating the skins, the lower heads and the upper heads. I'm sure that that's not the right word because I'm not a drummer, but anyway, you guys know what I mean. So you'd walk in and there was this like also ambient, but like much more active music playing. And then this costumed person who would like turn around and, in this like very dramatic fashion and welcome people to the lab. And then when people came in, the actor who was playing that role would cue people who were behind a curtain, that is a blank sheet of paper, would cue people behind the curtain to then trigger this sequence for the actual sort of manifestation of the AI, and then this was the script that the AI would give. Welcome to my lab. Thank you for your contributions in the parlor. Your emotional data is making a significant impact on my learning. I parsed through the data you gave me, and blank state is the emotion I found. But I don't understand why you wanted me to express this emotion. As my assistants told you, I have been scraping the internet for information about humans. You can imagine what kinds of crazy things I learned about your kind. Now I need to add to my corpus with data from actual human beings like you, and then it would say their names. Now we'll begin our inquiry with the question you all found the most intriguing. And then it would ask that question. And so this was actually the survey data that was taken from those initial surveys. So the names were taken from those initial surveys, the question that people were most interested in, and then that section of, I parsed through the data you gave me and blank state is the emotion I found. That is an emotional state that was identified based on the inputs that had been in room 1 when they were doing the Ouija board thing. So we built an AI that was doing a sentiment analysis on data that was being input and aggregating various kinds of data. And then what it was doing through the interaction in this second room was asking participants questions that it was generating by matching the sentiment of the input that it received. And so the first set of input was from the previous interactions, but then once it started asking questions, then people would give their answers. That docent would type in the answers in a text input field. Those would go through the cloud to an AI. The AI would then generate questions that match the sentiment of the previous answer, and then would ask that question. And so this is what that looked like.
Now I need to add to my corpus with data from actual human beings like you. I will begin our inquiry with the question you all found the most intriguing. What is the most human experience you've had?
So at this point they would answer, and then the docent would type that in, and then it would trigger another question. And it would go through a cycle of about 3 questions, and then we programmed a sequence that would sort of end that interaction, where the AI would kind of flee the scene, and then there would be this like explosion on the screen, and then you would see an image of the code that was driving the AI in real time. And at that point, we would do a debrief, which I do not have a picture of, unfortunately. But what was really great about that was that, we ran this show for 10 days, many times a day, probably 5 times a day, and did a debrief like with at least some of the lead artists after almost every single show. So it was really important to us because it was this super complex experience that people had just had. They had a really profound aesthetic experience while they were there, but no one had any conception of where the AI was actually in that project and how that all worked and what we were actually doing. And most of them thought we were recording conversations in the first room, which we had actually considered and probably would have done had we had a little more time to build in a function that would have allowed us to easily purge people's information if they didn't want it to be kept. But since we didn't have time to do that, we decided not to record at all. But anyway, we spent a good 10 to 15 minutes after each show breaking down what had just happened, why we're doing what we're doing, and sort of encouraging people to kind of keep talking about it and keep thinking about it. And that, as I said, was a really, really important part of the experience. And also at IDFA, the debrief is really important because, we're doing these things, like we're making this work about this technology so that we can actually drive conversation about it. And so those were acts 1 and 2 of the experience, and as I said, that ran for 10 days as part of the primary festival. We also did an act 3. We did performance art at Sundance a couple years ago, basically. We only did it once, and the idea of act 3 was really all about discovering the body. So the idea was that there would be a dancer who was actually sort of physically embodying the AI. And when we were developing the show, the metaphor that we were using, and it was something that I thought of, and this is sort of where injecting strategy kind of into the mix is really helpful because it's really just a story that everybody can organize themselves around. So the metaphor was that the body of the dancer was kind of like a tentacle that the AI was like sending out into the audience, because basically the way that the performance worked, Jacinda, who's the performer, and I'll show you a little kind of excerpt video of this in a second, but she was like moving through the space at various times, interacting with audience members and maybe touching them or asking them to like take their hand or to hug them or something. And the idea was that, here is an AI trying to understand what it means to be human, and so much of what it means to be human is to have a body. And so it was really amazing actually, because like the beginning of the performance, she was on a stretcher under a sheet, And so the beginning of the performance was like her coming alive and like falling off the stretcher. And we worked with this choreographer named Brandon Powers, and he and Jacinda developed this insane, not only a new system of dance, but actually a new notation for dance, because they basically developed the dance as though it were an algorithm. So usually when choreographers are developing dance, they're using bodies, and then they're writing and annotating what the body does. But in this case, they developed a system of annotation, and then she had to learn the dances based on the annotation. And the idea was that over time, as algorithms learn, they make fewer mistakes, and they follow this exponential trajectory. And so her speed and her trajectory and the way that the movements were coming together was also being prompted based on the emotional state in the room by the same mechanism that we had used in Act 2. So when people answered things, we would type them into the same system. It would generate an emotional state. That emotional state would go to Jacinda, to an earpiece Jacinda was wearing, and would actually prompt her to change the movements depending on the emotion in the room. So this is, and at the beginning of this, we did that appreciative inquiry in the lobby with folks. So when you see in this video, there's just like, it's a little 1.5-minute summary video. You'll see some of that and then into the performance. It was amazing. It was really, and it was really special, and it was a very packed house, and it was a little later in the festival. It was the Tuesday after the first, after opening weekend. So a lot of people had actually left already. There weren't, a lot of the people who come to the festival will come for opening weekend and then leave. So it was sort of interesting because we weren't sure if we were going to have a full room or not. And the first date that they had offered us was right in the thick of opening weekend. And we absolutely needed more time than that. And so it ended up working out really beautifully, and it was a really amazing, kind of this one-time experience, which I don't know, it feels like there's been a lot more, or maybe it's just where I'm moving around, but I feel like there's been a rise in performance lately. And I feel like I'm talking to a lot more people who are kind of dabbling in performance and performance art and performance that engages technology. And I think there's something really interesting about how ephemeral performance is, and just being there and having that experience. But I think for me, though, when I'm thinking about the kinds of performances that I want to create, I really want people to perform. I don't want people to sit in front of performers. I want to create experiences where audiences perform inside of them. So they're not audiences, they're participants. And that's actually a really great segue if we want to talk about a dinner with Frankenstein AI, I've also been talking for a long time, so I could also go through this quickly or not talk about it, talk about other things. We've been talking about Frankenstein for a while. Do you have any questions? Do you want a break? We've been talking for like, I don't know, 40 minutes straight or something.
The other things, and then we can Q&A it.
Yeah.
There's
Yeah.
it's this, we can talk about.
Totally. These are pictures of a dinner with Frankenstein AI. So what else am I doing? I've only put 2 things in here. There's a lot of other things kind of cooking in my brain, but the 2 things that I'm doing, so I'm not really supposed to talk about this, but I'm gonna talk about it, but I'm not gonna tell you where it is because that's what I'm not supposed to talk about. But this is a machine that I made, that dispenses liquid supplements to help you transform your energetic body to align with your personal growth goals. And those goals are assessed based on a survey that you take on an iPad that sits to the left of this machine. And please don't judge me based on the wires in the bottom, because I know they're a shit show, and hopefully they're less of a shit show now, but I don't actually know because I had to leave it with the people who are running this show to handle it, so we'll see. But the idea behind this project is just the idea that, well, so the sort of speculative reality of this project is that the science of vibes is actually real, and that we have arrived at a place where we can transform our own vibration kind of at the molecular level in sort of specific ways by taking supplements the way that we take supplements now. And that our physiological systems, in addition to regulating all of the things that we understand them now to regulate, also regulates us energetically. And I don't just mean energetically inside of our own bodies, I mean energetically between my body and this space and like the flow around me and the bodies in the room. And so the way that that works is the survey is designed to assess people based on 3 different sets of variables. The first is about entropy. So like in the space that you're in right now in terms of personal growth or transformation, to what measure are you kind of breaking things down? So like, are you deconstructing your current perceptions or norms, or are you building them up? And like probably you're doing both. So in what measure are you doing both? The second set of variables is about openness. So like, are you interested in receiving from the outside, or are you interested in manifesting? Do you know what you want and you want to manifest that thing? Or you actually don't really know what you want and are interested in kind of raising your intuition? And then the last is about flow. So do you want to go with the flow, or do you want to go against the flow? Are things working for you? Do you feel like you're moving through life without a lot of friction? Is that good? Because maybe you're slipping down a slippery slope that you don't want to slip down. If you want to change it up, sort of taking something that will go against the flow. And then each of those corresponds to one ingredient. Right now there's water in those bottles, but in this picture there's water in those bottles. Right now there is herbal tincture in those bottles. And actually it's funny, I had to buy more herbs. So I have, not the tincture, but I have bags of herbs in my bag because I need to go home and make more. And I didn't get to work with herbalists as precisely as I wanted to in terms of making the tinctures, just because I sort of ran out of time. But it's interesting because I had been exploring like what to do with this and what to put in the bottles, and I had different ideas. And my initial idea was herbal tincture, but I was like, maybe that's not going to be good because you have to use alcohol, and it's sort of. Do you all know what tinctures are? Sorry, so tincture is any kind of extract that's extracted by alcohol. So basically you can make those of you who might be familiar with tincture might be familiar with marijuana tincture, because that's common, maybe not. Maybe you're not familiar with that tincture, but you'll probably see it more as the world changes and these things become legal. But basically you can extract the essence of an herb by steeping it in alcohol. So like vodka in this case, and you just sit it in there for 2 weeks and shake it up a bunch and then strain out the solids, and then you have this liquid that's infused with an herb. And so it's interesting because here I am developing this speculative project that's based on the idea that vibratory resonance, the science of vibratory resonance has been proven. And I walk into the herbalist shop and I'm like, so this is the art project I'm working on. I want to make a tincture that helps people to manifest. And they're like, cool, mugwort. And I'm like, oh, I want to make a tincture that helps people like break down their perceptions. And they're like, oh yeah, licorice root. So it's interesting because I'm speaking in a language of speculative design, and I walk into a space where they're like, oh yeah, we do that here. We like transform you energetically. So it's also just interesting like as a frame, because I'm like, la la la, it's make believe kind of. I'm like still treading on the space where I want it to be real, and I'm moving forward in my life as though it's real, but I maybe don't totally believe it, but like I kind of do. And they're like, no, it's real. It's definitely real. We're gonna hook you up. So that's that, and so right now, that's installed as part of the set of a very large-scale immersive theater piece, and that will be running, through the fall, and then that machine will come back to me in New York City, and then I'm going to do all kinds of crazy shit with it. And it is going to be, I think, the first act in a multi-act experience that's really like pushing the boundaries of like, what is the personal transformation that people are seeking, and how can we sort of, create these cathartic experiences that help people feel more agency in transforming themselves into the people that they want to be. So that's one thing I'm working on, small thing. And then the last thing, and this is, I've actually been working on this for about 6 months, but we just announced it a couple weeks ago. So I'm the director of a new program at Cooper Hewitt called the Interaction Lab. And the Interaction Lab is a visitor experience design lab that's focused on kind of reimagining the experience at the museum with interactive design really at the center of it. And so, thinking about museum spaces as spaces that are multi-directional, as spaces that, that the core unit, the most essential piece of engagement is a single interaction. And so if we think about designing a visitor experience, what we're actually thinking about is designing a series of interactions that are related to each other and next to each other. And so to kind of go back actually and tie it up, because I realized I never did that with Frankenstein AI, and I just took you through this big ass explanation of it and didn't synthesize anything. So you went from filling out a survey and feeling a little bit probed and kind of uncomfortable to having an intense but very intimate conversation with a stranger in a very comfortable environment, but for the purpose of helping to teach an AI what it means to be human. And so creating a connection between those two things, that like I'm going to connect with another person and I'm going to use that connection to take responsibility for this training this other being that needs my help. And then you walk into a situation where that creature is asking you for your opinion on what it means to be human. So you're the expert. And maybe it's using you. I mean, that's possible. And I think, we wanted to leave that open to interpretation, but people left feeling much more responsible for AI and feeling like they had created this emotional adjacency with AI. And so in thinking about the Interaction Lab, and it's sort of ridiculous actually, because in many ways what we're doing there is like really basic. I mean, for people who think about designed interactions, but walk into a museum as an interaction designer, like, it's a nightmare.
What is it?
Oh, it's great, it's wonderful, the things are beautiful, but like, can you read that much? Fatigue. The language is not designed, like it's not written for a general audience. Most places lack storytelling. They're not thinking about what they're trying to teach you and how you interact with the information. They're like massive, they're massive information design and architecture problems in museums, but like also just like very little consideration for how people interact with those spaces and things. And it's not because people in museums don't care, actually. Like, people in museums care a lot, but it's because museums originated as like places to safeguard stolen things. And so like they were built with like thick walls and like conservation is a massive mission, and like protecting and safeguarding the stuff. And visitor-focused missions are like pretty new. And I found out kind of recently that they only introduced labels. So like not just a tombstone, which is like the information of an object or a piece of art, but labels being interpretive. So like talking about what a piece of art means in this country in like the mid-70s. So like I was born in 81, so like not within my lifetime, but like I'm 38. Like, I mean, it's not that long ago. So like 45 years ago. And so like if you work in a sector that only started to prioritize anybody but itself, like only 40 years ago, there's a lot of work to be done. And also, I mean, the toolkit that curators and storytellers in museum spaces had to work with until recently was very narrow. I mean, it's basically text and audio, so text and spoken text. That's not the case anymore. I mean, we have all of this, 2.5D, 3D projection. And we have a lot more storytelling media and a lot more capacity to build platforms to tell stories in different ways. And plus, like, storytelling just isn't really a competence in most museums. And most museums don't even realize that that's a problem. And also curators are like not storytellers, unless they just are as humans, but they're not trained that way at all. So it's really like a significant cultural misalignment. And so the idea with the Interaction Lab is to really be focused on who our audiences are and how they consume information and how we can create a system of platforms and like a delivery system that considers multiple touch points and multiple environments. I mean, basically just like what is contemporary interactive design, but applied to a sector that it's not really being applied to right now in the way that it should, especially a sector with so much potential as museums. And museums have they have so much content. They're like nothing, but they're like factories of content and stories. And so the fact that they're not being told and there's so much knowledge that's not being accessed or that's not being, opened up to be accessed in interesting ways just feels sort of like a tragedy to me, which I guess is why it's good that I'm doing what I'm doing. So anyway, that's what I'm up to. Thank you for listening to me talk for a really long time. This is the longest I've ever talked, like, in a stretch, so thanks for that. Please feel free to ask me whatever questions you want. I'm sure that I missed things, or I don't know, if I under-explained anything. Jesus, I hope not. Just because I've been talking for so long.
So does anyone have any questions?
Yeah.
What is 2.5D?
A mixed reality, like augmented reality.
Oh.
Yeah, sorry.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, yep. Yeah, it's nice. It's nice to think about it like that, right? Yeah, when I first heard that, I was like, oh yeah. So yeah, useful acronyms, 2.5D, that's not an acronym, and XR, extended reality.
What if the augmented reality is 3D animation?
I don't know.
I don't know. I'm just...
Should we take a vote? I have no idea. I do not know the answer to that. What do you think? What do you think? She's like, I don't care. Sarah worked on Frankenstein AI too. This is Sarah Henry. You graduated from IXC program, didn't you?
I graduated from this program in 2015.
Yeah, so Sarah is a friend and a colleague and developed the underlying structure of the emotional system, the sentiment system that drove the algorithm that also inspired the system of variables that went into my survey.